Unlike with most characters in Genshin, you actually shouldn't try to get a 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio on her stat screen. Not only that, but boosting her energy recharge will actually increase her damage output by more than giving her attack. And her Constellation 2 is actually more powerful than most characters' Constellation 6. Just some of the interesting facts about our Raiden Shogun. I promise we'll get into all the technical details later. But first, for the new players, a quick crash course, and for the veteran players, a very important refresher on the Raiden Shogun. This video is going to assume that the Raiden Shogun is going to be the main pillar in your team, so that is to say all the other characters are going to play around her. Despite her somewhat different stat scaling, the Raiden Shogun's actual kit isn't too complicated. Her elemental skill will do some electro damage in a small area, and it will also allow your active character to do electro damage on normal attacks. So with a short internal cooldown, whenever your active character does normal attacks, they will also trigger Raiden's skill and do some electro damage. Her burst is also pretty simple, so she pulls her sword out of her dealing a huge amount of damage, and then for about 7 seconds afterwards, her normal attacks will be enhanced, they'll do electro damage, and they'll be considered burst damage. So make sure you do as much damage as you can in these 7 seconds. Oh, and 2 more small details. The more characters that use their elemental bursts before Raiden, the more damage that Raiden's burst will do, so these are called resolve stacks. Additionally, when Raiden hits things with her normal attack while in her elemental burst state, she will regenerate energy for the rest of the party. Now fortunately, the Raiden Shogun's weapon choices are pretty straightforward. As with any other 5-star, she has her own dedicated 5-star weapon, Engulfing Lightning, also known as Grass Cutter, which gives her a healthy amount of energy recharge and attack. Pretty straightforward. So let's move on to her best 4-star weapon. Coincidentally, this is also pretty open and shut. If you don't have Engulfing Lightning, you'll want to get her the Catch, which is the 4-star weapon you get from fishing in Inazuma. It's got your energy recharge substat, just like Engulfing Lightning, and not only that, it gives you a huge boost to her burst damage, both the crit damage and crit rate of her burst. This is far and away her best free-to-play weapon, so if you don't have Engulfing Lightning, or you don't plan to get it, then make absolutely sure you get this. As a side note, this weapon is also very broken on Xiangling due to the fact that Xiangling needs a lot of energy recharge, and all of her damage also comes from her burst as well. And as a side note, if you do get Engulfing Lightning for your Raiden Shogun, then you can put the Catch on Xiangling, so it all works out. And if you don't have the Catch, well, you should get the Catch. Yeah, it's really that good. Nothing even comes remotely close. But if you are a really new player and you have the Raiden Shogun, then I suppose for the meantime, you can stick something like Favonius Lance on her, or maybe White Tassel. Of course, that is just a temporary measure though. Make sure you do get the Catch if you have Raiden Shogun. Anyway, let's move on to her artifacts. So once again, the Raiden Shogun has pretty much one undisputed best-in-slot artifact set, which is also, I'm pretty sure, crafted just for her. It does happen to work well on a lot of other burst-oriented characters, but it really was tailor-made for her, even the color scheme matches. And that is the Emblem of Severed Fate, or EOSF as it's often abbreviated. And looking at the 2 and 4-piece set bonuses, you can see right off the bat why it is extremely good on her. The 2-piece gives you a flat 20% energy recharge, which is always welcome, and the 4-piece will increase your burst damage based on how much energy recharge you have. As you can see, pretty much perfect synergy with the Raiden Shogun skill kit. Now, for the main stats on your headpiece/circlet, you're going to want either crit damage or crit rate, depending on which one you are lacking. For the timepiece/sands, you're going to want either energy recharge or, in extremely rare instances, attack. Pretty much always you're going to want energy recharge. You should only use an attack timepiece if the timepiece has a lot of energy recharge on it, as well as a lot of other good substats like crit rate and crit damage. But practically like 95+% of the time, you're going to want an energy recharge main stat on your timepiece. Then finally, for her goblet, you will always want electro damage, so nothing else really comes close. Even if your electro damage goblet has trash substats, just use it. As with the substat priorities, you're going to want crit damage and crit rate in roughly either proportions, so just get as much as both as you possibly can. This is pretty much the same as with every other damage dealer in Genshin. After that, your next priority will be either energy recharge or attack, depending on how much energy recharge you have. If your current ER is between something like 200 to 250, then you should probably prioritize energy recharge. From 250 to 300, you can give them roughly equal weighting, so energy recharge and attack. And then past 300% ER, you're going to want to prioritize more attack over ER. The reason being that the burst damage bonus you get from 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate will cap out at 300% energy recharge. Other stats beside that aren't really useful, so ideally on an artifact you want attack percentage, energy recharge, crit rate, and crit damage. The next one down would probably be flat attack or elemental mastery, so EM will be useful if you can trigger reactions like Hyper Bloom or Aggravate, which will require a Dendro character in your party. Other than that, we only really have defensive stats left, so obviously percentages are better than flats, and that's pretty much it. Now, for those of you who don't have a good set of Emblem of Severed Fate, well, you'll want to get one. Yes, it actually is that good, nothing comes close. No 2-piece combination or any other set really comes close for the Raiden Shogun. Now again, if you are a new player, what you can use in the meantime are 2-piece sets that give you either energy recharge, burst damage, or attack. So this would be the 2-piece of Emblem of Severed Fate itself, Nobliss, as well as something like Gladiator or maybe Shimenawa. For new players, this would be something like the Exile set or maybe the Sojourner set. Again, very temporary measures until you get a 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate set. And now let's move on to her constellations. So the Raiden Shogun actually has very overpowered constellations, especially her Constellation 2. In fact, her C2 actually gives her more of a power spike than a lot of characters' C6. And what it does is it causes her attacks to ignore 60% of opponents' defense when she's in her burst state. Now for those of you who play co-op, you may have noticed that when you go to lower AR players' worlds, then you do a lot more damage. And a big reason is because as the monsters get higher level, they get more defense. And that is the main thing that reduces the damage you deal to monsters as they get higher level. So cutting enemies' defense by 60% is a huge deal, and it usually works out to around a 40 to 45% damage increase. So that is her C2. As for her C3, her other notable constellation, this will just give you 3 levels to your elemental bursts. Pretty straightforward, and that works out to usually around a 15 to 20% damage increase. Her other constellations aren't really worth getting in my opinion. I mean, you know, unless you're a whale. But I will go over them real quick. So her Constellation 4 will increase all of your other party members' attack by 30% after her burst ends, so this isn't really that good unless you're using Raiden as a support role to support another character. Her C5 is pretty much worthless, so this will increase her skill by 3 levels, but skill levels don't really do a whole lot for Raiden. Her C6 is kind of interesting, so this will reduce everybody else's burst cooldown by 1 second every time she hits with her normal attack while in her burst state. So again, this is very dependent on the rest of the party, right? And it's not really, well, it actually has no effect on Raiden herself. It just benefits her team, and the extent to which it benefits her team is pretty unclear as well. It might do quite literally nothing because there's something else holding you back, aside from the other party members' burst cooldown, or it might actually shorten your rotation by quite a bit. So the value of this is kind of indeterminate, or at least heavily depends on the specific team that you're using. Now more importantly, let me just drive home the point of just how good her C2 and C3 are. Okay guys, so this is the Genshin damage calculator that I use. I will have the link in the description, and I'm going to use this tool to emphasize to you guys how good Raiden's constellations are, namely her Constellation 2 and 3. So as you guys can see, this is my Raiden Shogun build. I've loaded up all of her artifacts and her weapon and so on. And what we want to focus on is this right-hand column here. So this is the damage column. If we scroll down to Elemental Burst and we look at Muso no Hitotachi damage, 60 stacks, so we'll assume that she has all of her resolve stacks. And her average hit, this far right number here, is going to be 151,273, right? So 57k is her non-crit, and then 165k is when she crits. So on average, she's going to do 151k damage on the initial hit of her burst. Now, if we go over to the left here, right, we can change her constellations. So her C1, it doesn't actually give her more damage, it just allows her to build up her resolve stacks faster. So I guess if you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get her full resolve stacks, then this will increase your damage. But if you can, then this doesn't actually increase your damage. But if we go down here to Constellation 2, we can see a huge damage bonus. So it was 151k, and now it is 216, right? So if we get out our calculator app, so this is just the built-in calculator that Windows uses, and if we do 216 divided by 155, so I'm rounding it to the nearest thousand, that will give you a rough, oh wait, hold on. I think it was 151, right? 216 divided by 151. Her C, yes, it was 151. So if we do that, that is a 43% damage bonus that she gets from going to C2. Pretty insane. I think that's more than most characters get from their C6. And then now if we check her C3, right, so go 2 and then 3, it turns into 255k. And then of course if we input that, 255 divided by 216, so that was with her C2, then that is an 18% damage bonus. And if you really want to put things in perspective, so 255 divided by 151, so that was her damage at C0 or C1, right? 151. 69%. She literally does 69% more damage going from C0 to C3. Pretty insane, guys. Pretty insane. Make sure if you're going to use the Raiden Shogun, you at least get her C2. Her C3 if you want. So I got her C3, but I'm kind of regretting it a little bit because now I can't really pull for the 4 stars on Raiden Shogun banners, right? Because I don't really want her C6. So if you go down here, her C6, it just increases the rest of the party's attack after her burst ends. If your team is built around her, then the rest of the party's attack doesn't really matter all that much. Her C5 is just an upgrade to her skill. Once again, it's really not that useful. Her C6 is potentially useful, but we don't really know, right? So it will reduce everybody else's burst cooldowns when she uses her normal attacks in her burst state. And we don't really, as far as I know, we don't really have any kind of measurable increases for any team setup just yet. And while we're here, I might as well just show you guys the difference between the Catch R5 and Engulfing Lightning R1. So as we saw before, my Raiden with the Catch R5 does around 255k, right? So that is the initial hit of her burst at max resolve stacks. And if we change this to Engulfing Lightning, right, so at R5 Engulfing Lightning, it's going to be a pretty big upgrade, 297. But if we make it Refinement Rank 1, 260, right? So let's just get our calculator out. We'll be a little bit more precise this time. So 260,821 divided by, I think it was 255,128. Let's just double check. Yeah, 255,128. 255,128. 2.2%. So she's going to do literally 2.2% more damage upgrading to Engulfing Lightning R1 from the Catch R5, which I don't need to tell you is not worth it, right? If you're going to spend additional wishes on the same character, then just get Raiden's Constellations. Just get her Constellations. You're going to get like, at C2, you're going to get like a 40% bonus, and then at C3, another like 15-ish, 20%. Just go for Constellations. Forget about Engulfing Lightning, unless you really, really love Raiden, or unless you want to use the Catch on another character, right? So if you get Engulfing Lightning on Raiden, then you can free up the Catch for use on someone like Xiangling, right? It's really good on her as well. So that's one thing you could do, but otherwise, go for Constellations. Forget about their weapon. I really just did this to drive home how good the catch is. Okay, so we've pretty much covered everything we need to know about the Raiden Shogun herself, so now let's move on to her party members and teammates. So one of the great things about the Raiden Shogun is that a lot of her damage is condensed into a pretty short window of around 7 to 8 seconds, right? That is her enhanced burst state duration. This means that Raiden Shogun's ideal team involves stacking as many buffs on her as possible that last around that time. So the best overall team for her is probably still the Raiden Shogun Hyper Carry team, which has been around for, I think, around 2 years now. So this will be the Raiden Shogun herself, plus Kujo Sara, Bennett, and Kazuha. Now obviously this isn't the only team you can use with the Raiden Shogun, but I find that it is the best in terms of a combination of damage output as well as comfort. So let's go over what each of these characters contribute to the Raiden Shogun. We'll start with perhaps the most well-known character that more players are likely to have, and that's Bennett. So he only really does two things. He gives the Raiden Shogun a big attack buff, and he also heals your characters when they drop below 70% HP. So he does that by using his burst, so make sure you stay in the circle of his burst if you want to get those buffs. And he's also a pretty good battery, so if you're ever just a little bit low on energy, you can swap to Bennett and use his elemental skill and get 2 particles right there. And oftentimes, if Raiden's skill is active, then you'll also get an electro particle as well. So Bennett's pretty straightforward. He heals you and he boosts your attack. Next up, we have Kujo Sara. Now she doesn't heal you, but she actually does a lot more to boost the Raiden Shogun's damage. Similar to Bennett, she will give you an attack buff through both her elemental burst and her elemental skill. Although her elemental skill is a little cumbersome to use before Constellation 2. So if you don't have Kujo Sara at least C2, then you have to use her skill and then shoot an arrow at somewhere, and then you have to go to that somewhere and make sure you are within the explosion radius of the arrow in order to get Kujo Sara's attack buff. The other way is to use her elemental burst and make sure you swap to the character right afterwards that you want to receive the buff. So as long as Kujo Sara's burst makes contact with your character, then your character will get her buff. At Constellation 2, Sara's elemental skill becomes much easier to use. You just have to press it, and then you switch to your character, and the explosion will happen right at your feet. So to reiterate, both her burst and her skill will work. In fact, if you get enough energy recharge, you can apply Kujo Sara's burst solely by just using her ultimate, and you don't even need to touch her skill at all. Now, her other notable constellation is Constellation 6. If you get Kujo Sara to C6, then the same attack buff she grants will also grant you a 60% crit damage for electro attacks. And of course, the Raiden Shogun does electro damage while in her burst state. So Kujo Sara is hands down the best offensive buffer for Raiden, as long as you have her constellations. Oh, and just a side note, the buffs that Bennett and Sara grant you are both based on their base attack. So this pretty much just means their level and the base attack of the weapon they're holding. So to see that number, you just go into their character stats like so. This is their base attack. It is not the attack number you see in the character summary screen. Very important to keep in mind, attack boosting stats, for example on their artifacts or their weapon, will not increase the amount of the attack buff that they give to your other characters. Now let's move on to the 4th member of the Raiden Shogun Hypercarry team, and that is Kazuha. There are 2 reasons that Kazuha is a very good final team member. So number 1, surprise surprise, he gives damage buffs. So he will buff your team's electro damage according to his elemental mastery. So as you can see here, if for example you have 1000 elemental mastery, then your entire team gets a 40% electro damage buff when Kazuha creates an electro swirl reaction. And of course this works for any element, that's why Kazuha is such a great character in general. And on top of that, Kazuha provides very good crowd control. So his elemental skill will suck enemies in and group them together. That allows you to hit all of them at once with your Raiden's burst. He also does a pretty decent amount of damage himself, especially swirl damage if you have high elemental mastery, so definitely don't write that off. And then lastly, as with any animal sport, he can make use of PV, resident venereal. So of course, whatever element gets swirled, then anything that gets hit by that attack will have their elemental resistances cut by 40%, which again is very powerful. Now if you don't have Kazuha, then pretty much any other animal character will work. They won't obviously give you Kazuha's elemental damage bonus, but you will still get the crowd control, probably, and you will still get the VV buff, so Venti and Sucrose are good ones that come to mind. Another very noteworthy mention is Chevreuse. So her Constellation 6 is also extremely powerful, giving you up to a 60% pyro and electro damage bonus. And keep in mind, this is on top of her 4th Ascension passive, which gives Pyro and Electro characters in your party a 40% attack bonus based on Chevreuse's max HP. So to sum things up, with Chevreuse you're getting up to a 40% attack bonus and a 60% damage bonus to all Electro and Pyro characters in your party. With Kazuha, on the other hand, you're getting around 40% bonus damage, assuming you have 1000 elemental mastery, and you're getting 20% resistance shred from his artifact sets. And of course you do get some crowd control as well. Now barring the crowd control, it seems like Chevreuse is straight up a lot better, at least at Constellation 6, than Kazuha. However, one thing you have to keep in mind is that if the target enemy has high elemental resistances, then resistance shred is a lot better. I'll just give you guys a quick example right here. So let's say your Raiden Shogun does 100,000 damage with her Muso no Hitotachi, right? So 100k ult. And then let's say you're fighting an enemy with 90% electro damage resistance. And before you say it, yes, these do exist in the game. There are a few of them. And then also a few of them that have, let's say, like 50 or 70% electro resistance and so on. But anyway, if your target has 90% electro damage resistance, then your 100k ult turns into 10k. However, if you have Kazuha's resistance shred, then that 90% goes down to 70%, which means 30,000 of your damage will still get through. Basically, that 20% resistance shred just tripled your damage dealt. On the other hand, if we look at Chevreuse's damage bonus, then your 100k will turn into 160k. That's not exactly how it works because you'll have other sources of damage bonus, but for the sake of simplicity, let's say that that's what happens. Now it's that 160k that gets cut by your enemy's 90% electro damage resistance, and it turns into 16,000, which obviously is a lot less, in fact nearly half as much as the 30,000 that they would have taken if you had that 20% resistance shred. Yes, I did ignore some other factors like Chevreuse's attack buff and Kazuha's damage buff, but the main point of this example was just to get across to you guys just how powerful resistance shred can be. Okay, now, as promised, I did say that I would tell you guys why a 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio actually isn't ideal for Raiden. And the reason for that is, number 1, Kujo-Sara will give you a 60% bonus to crit damage. At the same time, if you're using the catch, like I am, then Raiden will have an additional 12% crit rate and 32% crit damage. So if we add these two together, then Raiden is going to get a 12% crit rate and an additional 92% crit damage for her elemental burst. What this means is that when Raiden's using her elemental burst, her crit rate is going to be 12% higher, and her crit damage is going to be 92% higher than what is actually displayed in your stat screen. So if you look at my stats here, right, it seems at first glance that I have too much crit rate, or put it another way, not enough crit damage. But if you were to add up the stats that I get from the Catch R5 as well as Kujo-Sara C6, then this crit rate here becomes 86.6, right? So 74.6 plus 12. And then this crit damage here becomes I think 220.5, right? So 128.5 plus 92 is 220.5. And of course, as we all know, if you have over 200% crit damage, then you already, can't get a 1 to 2 ratio because your crit rate is effectively capped at 100%. Pretty much what I'm trying to say is that if you're using the catch, and especially if you're using Kujo-Sara at C6, then you will really want to value crit rate more than crit damage. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's move on to the relatively simpler second way in which the Raiden Shogun is different from a typical main DPS / carry. And that is that she gains both bonus electro damage as well as additional recharge for her teammates from energy recharge. So if you look here, every 1% additional energy recharge will give the Raiden Shogun 0.6% energy restoration from Muso Ishin and 0.4% electro damage. So if you have 300% energy recharge, that is to say 200 more than the default 100%, then your teammates will restore more than twice. They'll restore 120% more energy from Muso Ishin, and the Raiden Shogun will get 80% more electro damage. So you can kind of see why energy recharge is such an important stat for the Raiden Shogun. Not to mention that she'll get plenty of sources of attack from Kujusara and Bennett and maybe now Chevreuse, which means the relative value of getting attack from artifacts goes down. Okay, so this video ended up becoming a lot longer than I intended, so let me just do a quick summary right here. The Raiden Shogun's best weapon is of course her signature weapon, Engulfing Lightning, but the difference between that and the Catch R5 is actually pretty negligible. At the same time, if you are using the Raiden Shogun and you don't have the Catch R5, make sure you get it as soon as possible. It is really that good. The Raiden Shogun's best artifact set is the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate set. Nothing really comes close, so if you are a Raiden main, make sure you are hitting up Momoji Dyed Court. Raiden's best Constellation is her C2, giving her a roughly 40 to 45% damage boost, and her C3 is also worth a mention, giving her a 15 to 20% damage boost. Her best all-around team is probably the Raiden Shogun Hyper Carry team, which consists of Raiden herself, Kujusara, preferably at Constellation 6, Bennett, and Kazuha. And finally, if you are going to use her in this team, make sure you get her a lot of crit rate and a lot of energy recharge. So that is it for the guide, but if you guys want to know about something that I didn't cover, or if you have any questions about something that I did talk about, or even if you have anything to add yourself, then please remember to do so in the comment section. I always love chatting with you guys down there. But for now, I hope that all of you go out and enjoy your newly pulled Raiden Shogun, and I will see you folks in the next video.